Hello, everyone. My name is Nahid Mansour, and I'm the Curator of Programs and Education at the Gardiner Museum. Welcome to our Bell Lecture, part of the Gardiner Signature Lecture Series. You will notice your mics and videos are muted and the chat option has been disabled. However, there will be a Q&A following today's conversation, and so we invite you to send us questions through the Q&A function at any point. Also, please note that this program is being recorded. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Toronto is located on the treaty lands and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Petun, and the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. The community we work in is the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and live on this land. Today, we're very excited to welcome Dr. Moujan Matin as our guest speaker. She will present her lecture titled The Blue Path of the Silk Road. I'll now turn off my video and mic and hand it over to the Gardiner Museum Senior Curator, Karine Sumis.
Thank you, Nahid. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you virtually for our annual lecture on Chinese porcelain, which is supported by the Bell family. About 20 years ago, Robert Murray Bell and Anne Walker Bell donated a significant collection of Chinese blue and white porcelain to the Gardiner Museum, introducing this field as an important area of collecting to the museum. Our Asian porcelain holdings have since then expanded through other important gifts. And for those of you who may be further away, who have not previously visited the Gardiner Museum or who long to return, I'm here showing you photos of our Chinese porcelain as it is currently on display in our gallery. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Moujan Matin. Moujan Matin holds a doctorate and master's degree in archaeological science from the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on the history of technology and art, with a particular focus on the development in ceramics, pigments, and glass production in the Near and Middle East, Central Asia, and China. Over the past years, she's been researching and experimenting on the use of cobalt pigment in historical ceramic glazes and has traveled widely, including to the city of Jingdezhen, China, and to the historical cobalt mining site in Kashan, Iran. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations at the University of Toronto, where her work is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada. I'll now turn off my video and mic and hand it over to Moujan.
Thank you very much, Karen. I really appreciate the introduction and also the opportunity to speak here today. I'm now going to share my screen. All right. So today I'm going to talk about the development of blue and white ceramics and the sources of cobalt used in Chinese and Islamic ceramics. And in doing so, I'd like to focus on two periods when there was a flourishing mercantile trade between China and the Middle East. Around the 9th century, there was really a radical shift from limited luxury trade to a more systematic export of customized commodities between Tang China and the Abbasid Middle East. They traded not only ceramics, but also metals, coins, spices, aromatics, dyes, and really all sorts of commodities. Later, from around the 14th century, under the Mongol Empire, transcontinental trade developed and was born on a level never seen before. And so today I'm going to begin with looking at ceramic interactions between Tang China and the Abbasid Middle East. And later I'll move on to talk about the Mongol Empire. Evidence for 9th century ceramic interactions between China and the Middle East come from two key sites: the city of Samarra in Iraq and Belitung Island in Southeast Asia. But let's look at Samarra first. Samarra was a 9th century court city. It was the capital, moved out of Baghdad in 836. It was founded on bare soil, so there was really no long history before it, and it was a purely Islamic site. Now, around the late 9th century, the city was abandoned. When it was abandoned, it was completely abandoned. And so here we have a nicely encapsulated set of materials from the middle of 9th century. Excavations in Samarra were led by German archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld between 1911 and 1913, so right before the First World War. And ceramics from Samarra were published slightly later in 1925. And this brought about a lot of excitement, especially among archaeologists and archaeological, sort of Islamic archaeologists. Here in Samarra, really large quantities of imported Chinese ceramics were found, together with their local Islamic copies. And so here you see some of the examples of Chinese ceramic sherds found in Samarra. Really here we're looking at a wide range, so green glazed stonewares, celadon wares from the Yue kilns in central and northern China, monochrome and polychrome wares, changsha wares, among other types. But perhaps more relevant to our focus today were the Chinese Tang white wares. Now, these were found in large quantities, and as you see, they have very specific shapes. These are shallow balls with a bit of rolled out rims. And the white wares were copied by Muslim potters in the sort of local earthenware technology. Of course, as you know, there's no tradition of high-fired ceramics in the Middle East. And so Islamic potters made use of a technology that had already developed earlier in the Islamic period, around 7th and 8th century, in Egypt and Syria, and really brought it up to perfection around 9th century here in Iraq. This was the tin opaque ceramic technology. So here, for instance, you see an example of Samarra tin opaque glazed ceramic. These are imitating Chinese imported wares exactly in their size and in their shapes. So that's quite fascinating. And the glaze you see here is tin opacified. So basically the glaze is colored white and is made opaque using tin oxide crystals. Now, I've included here an electron microscopy photograph of a section from the glaze into the body of a tin opaque glaze. So you see that tin oxide particles are scattered throughout the glaze thickness here. And on the surface, I just tried to show how the incoming light would be deflected by the tin oxide particles. So Islamic potters used this technology in order to imitate the whiteness and smoothness of Chinese white wares. But what was even more interesting is that they started using this white glaze as a sort of a blank background for a wide range of decorative techniques. So here, for instance, you see some of the examples of the so-called Samarra type pottery from 9th century, painted in green or in luster, which was quite a complex technology that developed around this period and was used on ceramics. But also, some of these were painted in cobalt blue. Now, this, as far as we know, was the first time that cobalt was used on Islamic ceramics in Samarra. So just a little bit about tin glaze. We'll move back to our cobalt story, but the glaze technology really didn't stop in Iraq. It spread all over the Islamic world. So you see here examples from 9th century all the way to the 19th century. The white glaze background in all these examples are the tin oxide glaze. With the expansion of Islam, technology spread westwards to Europe through southern Spain and Italy. And there it really became the dominant ceramic technology up to until 17th, 18th century, when European porcelain emerged. So here we really looked at some examples of imported Tang Chinese wares in Samarra. We saw how they influence really the flourishing of tin oxide glazes. And one of the decorative techniques that developed as a result of that was the use of cobalt blue on Islamic bodies. But we can look at these influences the other way around as well. So how was the encounters between Chinese and Islamic really, affected the production and development of Chinese ceramics at this time? And important evidence for that comes from the Belitung shipwreck, which sank off the Belitung island. The first remarkable discovery about Belitung shipwreck was the ship itself. So we know this wasn't a Chinese ship. It was made without any nails and pegs. The timber used in it was identified as East African, and the technology for the construction mainly used leached and stitched construction in its structure. So we know this wasn't a Chinese ship. It was rather an Islamic ship, and it was made very much in what was a Persian Gulf manner at the time. The cargo from this shipwreck was also very interesting. So about 60,000 pieces were found from in the cargo of this shipwreck. So this is a staggering number. And what's more interesting is that about 98% of this cargo was ceramics. So here on the right, for instance, you see some of the dishes, the pots that are packed in large jars. But they also used sort of spice bags in between the dishes as sort of packing material. And it was this interesting packing method that really enabled these pieces to survive in such fine conditions until now. And one, of course, has to remember that all that has remained from this shipwreck is all the material that would survive in water. So all the spices and other organic material that would have been in cargo are now gone. So here again are some of the examples of Changsha ceramics from the Belitung cargo. The large stoneware ewer you see in the middle, and also an example of a gold dish, very fine gold dish on the right. But quite remarkable in the cargo were 3 pieces of Tang Dynasty high-fired Chinese ceramics that were painted using cobalt blue. In their design, they are copying the opposite blue painted ceramics that I showed you earlier. They are sketchily painted, as you can see, but the designs are quite similar. The findings of these 3 pieces are quite important because these are the first examples of complete sort of blue painted ceramics from the Tang Dynasty that are high fired. So fast forward years, and here we are in the Mongol period. So unfortunately, there's a gap in our knowledge between the sort of the 3 Tang pieces that I showed, and the later Mongol Yuan dynasty blue and white ceramics. As some of you may know, the Mongols assembled the largest continuous land empire ever known. So basically from Sea of Japan in the east, all the way to the Euphrates in the west. So you see, so the empire was ruled by 4 descendants of Genghis Khan. So you see the Yuan dynasty in China painted in green, and the map, and the Ilkhanids in Persia, in Iran, painted in purple. So Chinese blue and white from Yuan dynasty. So by Chinese blue and white, white porcelain body that is painted in cobalt blue under the glaze. So as far as we know, these first started to develop around the second quarter of the 14th century. And evidence regarding their production comes from 2 cities, the city of Jingdezhen in southeast China, and the city of Kashan in central Iran. But let's look at Jingdezhen first. So blue and white porcelain was produced in Jingdezhen. This is still a very important ceramic center. Jingdezhen had access to wonderful clay deposits at this time, and it had access to the fuel needed to fire the large kilns that were producing Chinese blue and white wares. It had the technology, and it was also well situated as it had access to networks of rivers, so that the Chinese blue and white wares could be transported to the ports, especially in South China and Guangzhou. Now, Jingdezhen porcelain was being produced really on an industrial level. So here we're talking about, perhaps tens of thousands of pieces being fired at a time. So here you see the cobalt pigment being painted on white porcelain body. So once it was painted, the pieces would have been left to dry. Then they would be covered by a transparent glaze. Pieces would be put in what is called sagar, so basically cases that would protect the pieces during firing. And once they were fired, the gray cobalt pigment became this intense cobalt color that you can see here. So these are some examples of Yuan blue and white porcelain. Unlike the Tang pieces that I showed you earlier, the designs here are very much Chinese rather than Islamic. So here you see some of the very typical Chinese motifs, dragons and phoenixes, lotuses and peonies, all painted on Chinese porcelain. But there was certainly a large export drive for Chinese blue and white porcelain. In fact, the largest collection of Chinese blue and white porcelain outside China was in the shrine of Sheikh Safiuddin in Ardabil in northwestern Iran. So here the Safavid Shah presented a set of, I think, around 1,100 pieces to the shrine of his ancestors in 1608. And 3 years later, in 1611, they built this room called in Persian Chini Khane, China House or Porcelain House, to display the Chinese blue and white pieces. After the Safavid Ottoman Wars, most of these pieces were taken out of Iran, and they are now displayed in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, and some of them were transferred to the National Museum in Iran. Now, when talking about early Yuan Chinese porcelain, there are a couple of features that really clearly shows connections with the Islamic world. And also the fact that these wares were initially produced exclusively for the Islamic market. But first, let's look at their shape and their sizes. So the piece you can see here is about 42 centimeters in diameter, and some of them can be as large as 58 centimeters. So these are quite large pieces. Also, their shapes is very much suitable for serving communal food, which was very typical in the Middle East, but not at all in China. And so you see depictions of that in the wall painting, the Chehel Sukun Palace in Isfahan, where these blue and white pieces are being used for serving food. Now, the connection is the use of underglaze technology. So when we talk about Chinese blue and white, where this is really, in terms of technology, a combination of porcelain body and underglaze technique, sort of decoration technique. And the underglaze technology was used in the Islamic world from around the 12th century. Whereas in China, there aren't really any major history of, there's a major history of the use of underglaze technology. And so this is another clue that the glazing technology might have come to China from the Islamic world. And here you see some of the examples of early underglaze technique used on Islamic ceramics, so 13th century and 15th century here. Now, the other connection is regarding the source of cobalt that was used. And here is where archaeological scientific work has been really helpful and really had an impact on our understanding. So really early data on X-ray analysis of pigment on Chinese blue and white wares were published in 1956 in the Journal of Oriental Art by Stuart Young. And there was a follow-up paper by Sir Harry Gardiner, which interpreted the compositional data. Now, Harry Garner suggested in this paper that the source of cobalt used during the Yuan and early Ming dynasty must be imported. And this was based on the fact that there was a significant difference in the composition of cobalt that was used during Yuan and early Ming, as opposed to the later Ming and Qing period. Now, the first candidate for this imported source of cobalt was the cobalt mine in Kashan. All the information basically that was available about this mine came from the Persian treatise by Abu Qasim Kashani. The first manuscript, the earliest known manuscript, is dated to 1301, so early 14th century. Now, Kashani described the Kashan cobalt mine in detail about its location, its costs, and really different aspects of its production. But he also described the two types of cobalt minerals that were available in Kashan. Now, I'd like to read to you these descriptions. So the first type was a red kind found in the mine, which is a deposit on the outside of the stones and is like the red shells of pistachios. This kind is very strong, but is a fatal, deadly poison. Silver shining in a sheath of hard black stone. So I was extremely fortunate to have been able to visit this mine and conduct a brief survey in Kashan. So the mine is located in the village of Qamsar in the city of Kashan, right in the Caucasus Mountains, which is part of the central mountain range in Iran. So here on the left, you see the main cobalt vein, which crops out of limestone, and the cobalt vein, which you see on the right. But basically here, in our initial survey, all we could find were sort of black stones, and these were in hand specimen, it looked like these were mostly made of iron mineral magnetite. And it wasn't until we started hammering and crushing some of these stones that we found a pink crust that had formed along fractures and cracks, especially on the sort of the top layer of the vein. Now, we later identified this as mineral erythrite. And as you see in the formula, mineral erythrite has high concentrations of cobalt, but also arsenic. And so going back to Abu Qasim's description, the color quite matches what he talked about. So, you know, red shells of pistachios, but also the fact that it was a fatal, deadly poison was perhaps because of the high concentrations of arsenic that was present in this cobalt mineral. Now, the other cobalt mineral that was present was the mineral cobaltite. So again, you see this mineral has high concentrations of arsenic, and it is exactly like Abu Qasim said, it looks like white silver shining against the background of black stone, and the black stone in many cases is actually the iron mineral magnetite. So here in Kashan, cobaltite formed as primary cobalt mineral, And erythrite was the secondary type of cobalt mineral. And by that I mean it was the oxidized form that really formed on the top oxidized layers of the vein. So here, for instance, is an electron microscopy photo of the two cobalt minerals. So you see the cobaltite, the primary cobaltite mineral is being replaced by erythrite as it is oxidized. But what's also very important is the high concentrations of magnetite in the ore. And you can see it in this image here as well. In fact, our early analysis showed that the powdered ore contained about 95% iron and about 3% arsenic and only 1.5% cobalt. So as you see, cobalt is an important impurity here, but it's particularly a problem when we're dealing with ceramic glazes because iron can have a significant effect on the color of the glaze. And in fact, with 95% iron, probably completely of blue. So one can assume that they would do whatever they could to get rid of the iron. But I came across this text later on. This is quite late, later, so it's 19th century text, and this describes. But what's also interesting about it is that it tells us about how they enrich the cobalt powder. So they first take the stones out of mine, crush and grind them, and then pour them in big jars of water. And the gangue, which was probably the mineral magnetite and was the heavy sediment, precipitated quickly. This description, in fact, reminded me of what I had seen on the mining site. So there were quite large numbers of ceramic fragments found there, but these were quite thick and looked very coarse, and they seemed like they belonged to large ceramic jars, which might have been used, in fact, for the process on the site. So I started conducting some experiments following the 19th century treatise. So here you see that the two types of cobalt minerals, erythrite on the right, cobaltite on the left. I simply started crushing and grinding them. And here you see I try to replicate what was described in the 19th century text. So by pouring the powder in water, the heavier mineral magnetite immediately precipitated. And then I was able to collect the top water, which was more rich in cobaltite and erythrite. So here you see the difference. So the powder on the left is the powdered ore, and the one on the right is the one that has gone through the washing process. So you see it looks a lot lighter and it's lost some of its magnetite. Now, here on the left, this is just a very simple sort of borax pearl experiment. So this by no means is a proper glaze, but I just wanted to show you the color that would come from Kashan cobalt, and especially the black tint to it that you can see. And this is a result of the magnetites and iron minerals that are present in Kashan cobalt. On the right, you see a Yuan dynasty blue and white porcelain, and you can see really the depth of the color and also the black tint of color here. So just as a way of comparison, this dish is from the collection of Gardiner Museum. It's a later piece from late Ming dynasty. And we know now that during this period, the cobalt from Kashan was not used, or at least was mixed with other sources of cobalt in China. And you immediately see the difference in color when Kashan cobalt is not used. Now, a lot of compositional data published on Chinese blue and white wares, and by comparing those compositional data with that of Kashan cobalt, we've been able to distinguish sources of cobalt used in Chinese blue and white porcelain. So during the Yuan and Ming dynasty before 1425, so that would be exactly up to the end of the Yongle Ming dynasty, so prior to Xuande, the Chinese exclusively used the cobalt from Kashan. And after that, we have very limited knowledge of the sources of cobalt. We know that either the cobalt from Kashan was mixed with local Chinese sources, or that they completely gave up on Kashan and started using local sources. Now, some of you might have seen in the news last week that there was a Ming bull found in a yard sale. That turned out to be one of the rarest examples of its kind. But what immediately drew my attention was the color of the blue pigment here. And you see the characteristic feature of Kashan cobalt, again, the black tint to the color. And it was in fact, the piece was in fact dated to 1400 to 1425. So perhaps the last period in China when Kashan was the sole source of cobalt in Chinese blue and white porcelain. Since I talked a bit about Ming porcelain, I wanted to mention that there are mentions of Kashan cobalt in some of Ming literature. So the cobalt from Kashan is usually referred to as Hoi Hoi Ching, so the Muslims' blue, or Somali Ching. Now there's a bit of a debate about the term Somali. We know from different texts that the Kashan cobalt mine was known by people to have been discovered by Prophet Suleiman. And so some think that Somali might be a variation of Soleimani, and that it's referring exactly to its source. Whereas some others think that Somali is actually referring to the island on maritime Silk Road, where the Chinese would have probably got their Kashan cobalt from. So it's really a reference to the transportation of these cobalt minerals. So I talked a bit about Chinese ceramics, but similarly, there was compositional data available on Islamic ceramics, and comparison with the composition of Kashan cobalt ore shows that basically all the cobalt that we know was used in Islamic ceramics from 12th century up until the 19th century came from Kashan. The only exception was the Iznik wares, and the composition of cobalt on those seem not to match with Kashan. And also the earlier samples, the Abbasid blue that I showed you earlier in this talk from Samarra, for instance, the cobalt blue on those also doesn't match that of Kashan. So the cobalt on the Abbasid verse is very high in zinc and does not have much arsenic or iron. Also, the three tank pieces found from Belitung wreck, they seem to be high in cobalt and copper, but initial analysis have shown that they don't contain arsenic or iron. But this is still sort of research that it's at its early stages. So I think there should be a lot of more work done in the future on that front. So I think I'd like to finish by showing you this image. So the cobalt from Kashan was really an important commodity at this time, and it was really being used all across the Mongol Empire, from Egypt all the way to China. And you see some examples of ceramics using the cobalt from Kashan. And it was really the interactions that formed as part of these technological and stylistic exchanges that helped with development of Chinese and Islamic ceramics, especially during the Mongol period. So I think that's all from me. I'm sorry if my voice wasn't very clear. I now stop sharing.
So thank you so much, Moujan, for this fascinating journey where you blended art history, science, archaeology in such a compelling way. We've received a few questions and we have time to take some questions. One of them pertained to the cobalt itself, but also which I think you addressed in your talk, but also about the source of tin that was used and the process in its refinement and where the tin used in the tin clays was sourced. Can you expand on that aspect of Islamic production?
Right, that's a very good question. So for tin, there is unfortunately very limited knowledge about the sources. It's not until later period that we know of sources, especially when talking about European tin glaze wares. For the earlier period, we know very little, very little about the sources. Some medieval texts talk about sources of tin in Bulgaria, but there haven't been any evidence or any surveys to help confirming that. With cobalt and the cobalt used during the Abbasid period on Islamic ceramics, again, there's very little information. So it's, I guess the important clue about those is the high concentrations of zinc. And you know, so one has to think about mines that contain zinc, but the complication is that we know in the Islamic period, zinc, sort of brass was, you know, a lot of like mortars and pestles that were used for grinding and crushing were made of brass. And so zinc might also have been an impurity that was introduced through the processes and treatment processes. So yes, there's a bit of lack of information on that front. Yeah.
Another question concerning the Belitung shipwreck and one pertaining to the method of packing. Can you repeat how these pieces were packed in such a way that they survived, and also where the artifacts are now housed?
So, so there have been some remnants of spices in some of the large jars that I showed you. And but of course, all the other evidence have gone because spice is organic material. It hasn't survived in water. But basically, what we think is that they used bags of spices as packing materials in between dishes, and these were packed in large jars. And so that's why they survived in such great conditions until now. And the finds are now placed in Singapore Museum. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question from Susan. Is cobalt still used for ceramic production in Iran today?
Cobalt,
in current production.
Yeah, cobalt is still used in Iran, but it's not sourced in Kashan anymore. So in fact, the mine is not active, no longer active. So the latest text that mention the cobalt mine of Kashan is in 19th century. And we know, especially from texts by European travelers, that it was until the Qajar period in Iran that this mine was active. After that, we're not quite sure what happened. So the cobalt that is used currently in Iran comes from Europe mostly.
Interesting. There are a couple of questions regarding the mining of cobalt in China. At which, can you expand on the moment when China turns to its own sources of cobalt? Where are these found? And also there was a question which pertained to the arsenic content of the cobalt found in China as well.
Right. So the Chinese sources, the ones that are well documented, are mostly in the Yunnan area in southern China. And the Yunnan mines are known to have high concentration of manganese. And so for that reason, we think that the tint of color that was produced using those sources tended to be more purple. And you probably noticed that in the late Ming piece that I showed in one of the slides. So during the late Ming and Qing dynasty, we find a higher concentration of manganese and lack of arsenic and iron. And so we think these might have been the sources, but there haven't been really any surveys of mines, of Chinese mines done so far. And I think I missed the second part of the question.
Oh, the second part was about the arsenic.
Right, the arsenic. So no, I can't recall any major concentrations of arsenic in Chinese sources. And yeah, I'm not sure. So when Kashan is used, it's really it's really like 4.5 the glaze composition that you would find arsenic maximum. The Chinese, the local Chinese sources, I can't recall if any was detected actually.
Interesting. And as a follow-up question to that, one question came in about the health implications of working in those mines or working with these materials in Iran at the time. Are there any sources that comment on that?
So the only mention that we know of is by Abu Qasim, and it's the one that I showed. He mentioned that the fatal disease and that it's quite poisonous, but we don't know much about that. But I think it's again the high acid content that can also have an effect on how expensive the cobalt from Kashan was, because it was difficult to treat the ore and it was poisonous, so that's sort of made it even more valuable perhaps.
That's that's very interesting to weigh these risks against the price of the product. There was also a question pertaining to the transportation of these, of the materials themselves. Were these transported from Iran over land or rather by sea with other imported objects?
Right. With the ceramics themselves, I think we can perhaps talk more about the sea trade, especially because, you know, ceramics are fragile objects and, you know, land routes, although possible, it would have been a lot more difficult and perhaps a lot more dangerous. When talking about cobalt blue pigment, there isn't much evidence, but one can think that it was possible that these were traded both through land or through sea. Although the mention of Somali chink might give us some clues that these might have been transferred through sea mainly. But this is basically all that we know from the text.
There are so many questions that came in and that are still coming in. So I'll just take a few more. Is there any evidence of Chinese artists painting vases for the Islamic market and vice versa? So those types of artistic exchanges, did they happen at that point?
You know, there are Chinese pieces that have Arabic inscriptions. So certainly this was something that was going on. But what's difficult to pinpoint is whether Chinese artists really travel to the Islamic world. And this is something that many scholars have been curious about, but unfortunately there haven't been much evidence on that. And of course, you know, I think it's the role of Muslim merchants here that really affected this trade. So yes, certainly, we know that many of these designs and inscriptions were exclusively targeted for the Islamic world. But talking about specific artists would be very difficult.
Yes, I can imagine. So I'll read another question. Although the cobalt might be the same applied to the Chinese and Islamic examples, could the color be different due to the various composition of the porcelain body itself, of the color of the clay?
I would say, yeah, perhaps it could be, but it would have very sort of, you would see very slight difference. I think what would make the color different between Chinese and Islamic ceramics is the way the Chinese would have treated the pigment they received. I think it's in one of the later texts, perhaps the Qing dynasty, if I'm not mistaken. So it mentions that the Chinese used magnets to further purify the cobalt pigment. And we know that, you know, these pigments had a lot of magnetite in them. And it seems that in China, the cobalt pigment was even further enriched in cobalt. And so that, I think, might have a really important effect on the tint of color that was achieved in China versus East.
Great. So I'll take just one last question. Were there any clay mines or pottery production villages in the result of the economical spin-off in proximity to the Kashan cobalt mines that can be of any significance to the artistic styles that we see in Persian ceramics?
Gosh, well, the short answer is that, you know, Kashan was already a very thriving city at this time. So, and it wasn't just the cobalt that was significant about it. Kashan pottery during medieval period is perhaps the best known from Iran. It's the most significant that we know of. I guess it was, you know, it was these different industries going hand in hand in Kashan. So the cobalt mine, but also the pottery industry that was really thriving during medieval period in Iran.
So there are many more questions, but we're running out of time. So thank you to everyone for your enthusiasm about the topic. It's really a fascinating topic, and we hope to be able to hear more about your research and archaeological finds in the future. So before we go, I'd like to mention our upcoming Gardiner signature lecture, which will be held on Thursday, April 29 at 1 p.m. And here you have the information on the screen. And it is a lecture entitled Making Their Marks, a Woman During Seb's First Century, which will be delivered by Dr. Alison McQueen. A completely different topic. The registration is now open for Gardiner Friends, and it will be open to the general public next week. The recording of the current lecture for today will be available in the near future on our YouTube channel, and we apologize for some of the technical difficulties that we've experienced today. So thank you so much, Moujan, for being here with us today, for your great talk, and thank you to all of our audience for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.